Hello, Mike here. Now, in the last video I put together, we talked about SageMaker, Amazon SageMaker. We looked at what it was from a technical perspective and the technical components. So quite often we look at it from the point of view of the functional components, so the data side, the building side, the training side, the deployment side of models and machine learning models. But in this video, we broke it down into technical components. And if you've not had a chance to look at that video yet, then I'll put a link up here and you should definitely take a look at that video. There, what we did is we looked at these individual components, and it gives us an opportunity now to dive into those in a bit more detail. And that's exactly what I want to do in this video, because in this video, we're going to take a look at SageMaker notebooks. Now, the reason why I've chosen SageMaker notebooks and not SageMaker Studio yet is because SageMaker Studio is a bit like an evolution on top of SageMaker notebooks. So looking at notebooks gives us a good grounding in Jupyter and Jupyter Notebooks, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And it also, you get to see the differences. When we go to Studio and we look at Studio, you get to understand some of the differences and the different ways that it works compared to a traditional Jupyter Notebook server. So that's why we're starting with SageMaker notebooks. And as I've already described in the last video and somewhat now already as well, SageMaker Notebooks is a managed Jupyter Notebook server. So what are Jupyter Notebooks? What is a Jupyter Notebook server? So a Jupyter Notebook is a file. It's an IPYNB is the extension to this file. And inside of that file contains documentation and code, and also potentially the output from that code when it's been run in the past. So we actually start off with a blank document. We can then come in there and insert different cells. Primarily, the two different use cases we have are to have a cell which has got rich text inside of it. Using Markdown syntax, we can go ahead and put headlines, bullet point lists, ordered lists, graphs, images, pretty much whatever we like. Anything that you could get on a web page, pretty much you can kind of get inside of one of these cells. This is great, right? Because it gives us the opportunity to be able to document what we're doing. And that is one of the key things and purposes and use cases for Jupyter Notebooks. It allows me to be able to create a document to share with you. And then when you take that document, you've got a clear set of instructions as to what the thinking was, why I did something in the way I did it. Maybe I'm asking some questions. Maybe I'm seeking collaboration. And so it's a fantastic way to be able to document what you're doing and share. So that's that cell. The next cell that we can and we will put into this particular notebook is a code cell. And so here we have some actual code. It's nicely syntax highlighted so we can sort of read it easily. But the key difference here between any normal document and a Jupyter Notebook is because it's running on a server inside of this server environment, we can click the play button and it will actually execute that code. And the output from that code is then displayed just underneath that cell. And that's pretty much what a Jupyter Notebook is. It runs on a server, so a Jupyter Notebook server, and that server is configured with kernels. Now, kernels are a lot like virtual environments. So if you're familiar with programming, say on a laptop computer, then in order to be able to abstract yourself away or contain yourself away from the actual operating system of your computer, then you'll often create virtual environments that you can put your code inside of, including the libraries that you're using inside of that virtual environment, so that you don't impact other things on your laptop, so the operating system itself, or other projects that you're working on, which can be in their own little virtual containers. So kernels inside of the Jupyter Notebook server form a very similar function. So inside of the kernel, you can have different libraries predefined with what you want to use. So inside of a machine learning environment, that could be MXNet, TensorFlow, PyTorch, and it could be scikit-learn, could be NumPy. All of these types of libraries that you want to use can be stored inside of a kernel, and then you run a kernel environment around the notebook that you're running. So on a given server, you could have multiple notebooks that are currently running, and they would all be running inside their own kernel. And so that's important. If I'm running code and creating variables and data structures and objects and classes and that kind of thing inside of a notebook, then they will remain inside of that running notebook instance, and I can have multiple notebooks running, each with their own environment that they're running in, with their own variables, with their own kernel. So that's a sort of an overview, if you like, of how Jupyter Notebooks work. We'll have more of a play around with Jupyter Notebooks later on in this video. What I'm now wanting to talk about is SageMaker Notebooks. So SageMaker Notebooks is a managed service from AWS, which allows us to be able to do a pretty simple 1 or 2 click deployment of a Jupyter Notebook server. Now, do you need to do this inside of SageMaker, or can you go and do this somewhere else? And yes, you could go and do this somewhere else. You could go and spin up EC2, an EC2 instance. You could then go and install Jupyter Notebook Server and use it and use that environment instead. The difference there is that you would then have to configure everything about it, and that includes patch management of the operating system, of the underlying libraries, and the SDK, any software which is running on that instance. That's your responsibility if it's an EC2 instance to go and manage that. You also have to manage things like permissions and the network security and the connectivity and the encryption and all of that kind of stuff. Now, with a SageMaker notebook, a lot of that is taken care of for you. And if you want to, you can customize some of it, but out of the box, a lot of it is taken care of for you. So the management of the box itself, the patch management of the operating system, the patching of the SDKs, and all of those libraries that I talked about. Now, when you go to create a SageMaker notebook, you also have to select some of the parameters that you want in the notebook that you spin up. And so you do get to choose things like what kind of server that you want to run on. What capacity of a server do you want to run your Jupyter Notebook on? You can also choose things like custom encryption. You can also choose things like how to connect into a VPC or a virtual private cloud that you have inside of your AWS account. But the server itself doesn't sit traditionally inside of your account as such. It's very much like a traditional running Lambda function. It runs somewhere, it's accessed through your account, you can configure it through your account, but it's not sitting inside of a VPC. That's very much how a SageMaker notebook server works. It's there somewhere. You can't see it in the list of all the EC2 instances, but you can see it, of course, in the SageMaker console listed there as something which is currently running. So let's go ahead and quickly create an Amazon SageMaker notebook server. So I'm going to navigate to SageMaker and click on that link, open up the SageMaker console. At some point, I should probably do a video just going through this console page, going through all of the sections here. But for now, we're just going to do this notebook. So let's go to Notebook on the left-hand side. I'm going to click Notebook Instances, and you'll see that currently we have none. So I'm just going to go quickly through this. Let's go to the top right, Create Notebook Instances or Instance, and it says, okay, give me a name. So this is going to be my notebook server. And then it asks you for a notebook instance type. And so this is where we can select the resources that we want to have available for our running notebook server. And I'm going to talk more about this when we get into the actual server itself. Now, you'll notice that all of these instance types are all ML dot something. So these are different to the families of instances you'll see in EC2, for example. So we've got T2 medium, T2 large, but this is an ML T2 medium. The ML means essentially two things. One is that it's not going to show up in the EC2 instances inside of your account, and also it's going to have an AMI pre-installed on it that will have all of those machine learning libraries already loaded. So we can go ahead and choose whatever we want from here. I'm just going to go ahead and choose, I think, T3 medium, because I like to be up with the latest family type. So T3, I get a better cost performance for that. And I'm going for a medium. I'm not going for a very large server here. I'll show you why and explain why in a moment. Next, we get to choose permissions here. So we have an IAM role that we need for this actual server. So this is the same as an instance role for an EC2 instance, where we provide permissions to the instance so that it can connect into other services inside of AWS. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop this down, say create new role, because it gives me the ability to do this inside of the console. I'm just going to say give me a policy which allows me basically to get to anything. So any S3 bucket, you can lock this down fairly easily. If this was in production, I probably would, but it's not. So that's the role created and selected for me. I get to choose an encryption key if I want. I'm not going to do that. I get to choose some network options, such as being able to tie into a VPC. So if there's data inside of a VPC, then I need to get that. Then I'd set it here. I don't have that, so I'm not going to do that. Git repositories, if you have some code, especially Jupyter notebooks that are sat in a GitHub repository somewhere, you'd configure it there. And tags, which you should always configure all the time, but I'm not going to this time because it's just a demo. So let's go ahead and say create notebook instance, and it'll go ahead and it will go and do that. Now it'll take a couple of minutes to create this. Yes, it's saying that I have successfully requested my instance, but I'm still waiting for it to build. And I basically have to sit here for a couple of minutes, pressing this refresh button, waiting for this status to say, I don't know, something positive and green, like ready and let's go. So I will now wait for that. And after a couple of minutes, here we go. So we have in service is the status we were waiting for. And we have in this actions column here, a couple of links, Open Jupyter or Open Jupyter Lab. Now, if you remember from my conversation about SageMaker before, I said that SageMaker Studio was actually built on top of Jupyter Lab. And your SageMaker notebook server here actually has the option of running in both modes. But we're going to open up in the standard Jupyter mode for now. And here we are. We're inside of the SageMaker notebook server, the Jupyter notebook server. And we're greeted by this empty list. There's nothing here. It's waiting for us to do something. So this is where we see a list of all of our notebooks. We've got various tabs across the top, which make not much sense at the moment when we don't have anything running in here. So let's go straight ahead and create a new notebook, which we can throw some code into and see it working. So I'm going to go to new over on the left-hand side here. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to choose one right at the bottom here because I know ahead of time what I'm going to be doing. This is selecting the kernel that we want to use. And you can see that in the SageMaker notebook list, because this is essentially pre-configured by Amazon for us, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of kernels that we can use. So Conda is the kernel technology they're using. And then after that, you can see that we've got MXNet and Python things and PyTorch and TensorFlow. There's some Spark Magic stuff at the top, all kinds of stuff in here. So we can choose the one which suits our needs for this particular notebook. If it's not right, and if we want to change it, we can do. So it's not inextricably tied forever to the notebook we've created. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and choose TensorFlow with Python 3.6. So I click that, it opens up another tab, and then we should see a blank notebook. Here's our blank notebook. Now, before I was talking about the structure. So you had cells, and in the cells you could have different kinds of content. So in this cell here, for example, let's put some markdown in here, some rich text. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this down to markdown, and the text in here I can now write as markdown. So a hash is going to give me some kind of headline. This is my sample notebook. Not really anything too original. We are going to learn. What are we going to learn? Let's say how notebooks work. Lots of great stuff. Obviously, just an example. Okay, so I've done some markdown syntax here. There's a headline here, and this 1.1. is going to give us an ordered list. So I hit Shift and Enter on that cell. It runs the cell, and now we've got some formatted code. If I double click into that, I can go back and edit it, and I can click the Run button here. I just went straight to the keyboard shortcut, but you can press Run, and that will run that cell. Now, here is a brand new cell entered in underneath already for us, and now I I can go ahead and put some code in here. Let's go ahead and actually create something machine learning-y. And for that, I'm going to go to the TensorFlow webpage and go for the sample code for the beginners. For beginners, here is some sample code, and we can just take all of this and put it into our notebook. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take it step at a time. So I'm going to copy this first part out, bring it over to my notebook, put it in the top here. Then I'm going to press plus, and I'm going to have another cell. I haven't run it yet. I'm going to take the next 2 lines down, and I'm going to put that in here. And what I'm doing is I'm building up a notebook with cells of code which kind of makes sense. Like I can split these things apart so that in the future I can talk about them in comments, maybe above the cells. We'll do that. And I can run them independently when time comes. So that's what I'm doing that for. And I'm almost done. And, we're making a pretty decent notebook here of the code. Nothing special, of course. And yes, I'm just taking this directly from the documentation. What this is going to do is train a model to recognize the NIST handwritten character dataset. So now we can go ahead and we could run this code. But again, this is a notebook that I'm wanting to share with people potentially. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more documentation. So I'm going to say insert above this particular cell here. And I'm going to say, let's set up some libraries. And it's not yet in Markdown, so let me change that to Markdown and hit run on that cell. Okay, and now people can see what we're going to do in this next cell. Now I'm going to run this cell, and this little star comes up, this little asterisk comes up next to the cell to say I am now being run. And so it is being run and it's loading those libraries. It's going to take a little while, a couple of seconds to do that the first time around. Also, it might end up spitting some warnings out underneath this because TensorFlow always does, in my experience anyway, because the versions of code, TensorFlow is continually moving and they want you to know about the updates and what you do differently in TensorFlow. And even the code which is kind of imported from TensorFlow has these warnings in it. So in a moment, this will load up. It's still loading. Goodness me. So it's going through. The next line down, let's go ahead and press run on that now. And you'll notice that it is also got an asterisk next to it. Now, it's not running. It's waiting for this cell above to run. And when it's finished running, then it'll run. So you see that it has finished. It immediately came up with that warning. It is fine. And then it went and ran this cell straight away afterwards. And what it's gone and done there is it's gone and loaded the MNIST dataset. This is a dataset of images of handwritten characters. Now, we can't see that at the moment. We can't see this dataset. So let's do something about that. Let's go insert cell below and let's import another Python library. So import matplotlib pyplot as PLT. Let's go ahead, Shift Enter on that. So we're loading the matplotlib library, which is really useful for plotting things, graphs particularly, but we can also use it for displaying images. So let's go insert below and say PLT, which is our shortcut to matplotlib, image show, and then we're going to pick up one of the images that we've got from our training data set that we loaded up here. And so let's go ahead. We've got xtrain, and so let's go for the first object which is inside of xtrain, which is xtrain at position 0. Let's go ahead and run this. And so we have an image in our data set, and I think that's supposed to be a number 5. We could change this to say, let's show us the 10th or the image at index position 10, which I suppose is the 11th. Let's press run on that. And that looks like a number 3. I like doing this so we can see data. And this is one of the great things about Jupyter Notebooks is that you get the ability to be able to output this graphic fairly easily compared with doing something, for example, on the command line or just in a text editor. You don't necessarily have that easy ability. So this is starting to look pretty good. We've got this imagery and rich text. let's keep moving on through the code. So here we have a model which has been defined in TensorFlow. It's using Keras. It's basically a simple sequential multi-layered neural network, and it's ready to take the input from the MNIST character dataset. Let's define that by clicking Run. It shouldn't take very long at all because it's just defining that model. We get more TensorFlow warnings. That's okay. Then we go ahead and compile the model. So let's run that. And then finally, we can click on this model fit, which is going to go ahead and create this model. I'm not talking in depth about TensorFlow during this video or any other kind of machine learning, really. What I'm trying to show you here is that I'm running my Python code in an interactive session inside of my Jupyter notebook, which is running inside of my SageMaker notebook. And you notice that to get to this point, we didn't have to do very much. We just went to the console, said, I want a SageMaker notebook server. We got one, and then we were able to come straight into here and start to use, for example, in this case, TensorFlow, because the kernel already existed with TensorFlow and Python ready for us to go. And our model has already been trained. So, well, this is great. Let's go ahead and see if we can use this model to actually make some inference. Let's actually use it to recognize some of the characters. So that's what we've done, is we've created a model which should be able to recognize the handwritten character and tell us what number it is. So let's go in here and say model predict, and then we need to pass in an image. So let's put this one in because we know what this one is already. It's a 3. And I'm going to need to embed this in a list of lists. This is just what the structure that the data is expected for this model. So let's press run on that. And we get an array out. And if you know about machine learning, this is basically the value of each of the output nodes of the neural network that we put together. There should be 10 of these values, and which value is the highest is basically the prediction which is being made. We can do something a little bit smarter than this. So let's import NumPy as NP, and I pressed Shift Enter on that. And this time I'm going to basically run the same thing again, but I'm going to type in NP argmax. So this is just a function which will find the largest value in this list for us without us having to go through and trying to figure it out, especially with all of these times 10 to the power of numbers. So let's go ahead and run that. And we end up with 3, which essentially is the label that we're looking for. So is it a 3? Yes, it is. Okay, let's go and render a different image from elsewhere in the data set. The 21st image here, let's press run, and it looks like a 4. So let's go down here and say, look up the one at index position 20. And we're going to press run on that. And yes, it says it's a 4. Fantastic. So what we've done there is we've run the Python code inside of the kernel, inside of our Jupyter Notebook server. And there's something important about what I've just done that I want to explain. We ran this code in this server. This model trained on this server. So yes, it was only a T3 medium, but it was still perfectly powerful enough to do this relatively simple task. Again, it's running on this server. So we're not reaching out to any of the other SageMaker services to train models inside of SageMaker model training, for example. We haven't done that, but that is absolutely what you can do. So you can have your Jupyter Notebook server with a relatively small instance type, for example, this T3 medium, and do large production jobs, because essentially what you're doing is using the code inside of the notebook to reach out to other SageMaker services to train your model or to do the data processing, whatever it is that you're looking to do. And you can find examples of how that works. If I go back to my home folder here and I click on this SageMaker examples, there is a whole raft of different example notebooks for all kinds of different training and image processing jobs that you can do in SageMaker. And these samples are absolutely part of the SageMaker product family. So many of these samples are production quality code that you can take and adapt to doing what you want to do, the problem space that you're looking at. So if we go here to, say, for example, image classification, we can just preview it, or we can go ahead and use it. Previewing it is just going to show it to us. Using it is going to copy it into our environment. So let's go ahead and say use, and it's going to tell us all the files it's going to bring on board. So I say create a copy, and it'll put us into this notebook ready to run. So we can go ahead and run the cells which are here if we wanted to do so. Now, I'm not going to do that now for the sake of time, but what I wanted to show you is that this is importing the SageMaker SDK. We're absolutely going to go into more detail on the SageMaker SDK, and as we flow through here, what you'll see is that we're using the SageMaker SDK to go and call out to SageMaker to do the training. So this training isn't going to be done inside of this notebook server. The code that runs in this server is going to call upon other SageMaker services to train our model. And so that's the key difference between the way this code works to the code that we just looked at with TensorFlow, that we copied in from the TensorFlow website. So you don't necessarily need an enormous SageMaker notebook server. You can often get away with something small because all you're really doing is calling some SDKs and API endpoints. And that's SageMaker notebooks. Finally, in here, I can just go to this notebook that we just created, and I can click shut down so it stops consuming resources. Ultimately, I'll want to go to the SageMaker console and shut down this server as well. So that's Jupyter Notebooks, and that is also SageMaker Notebooks running in a SageMaker Notebook instance running inside of your own account. Remember, turn them off periodically and restart them so that AWS get an opportunity to refresh all of the operating system, the patching, and the SDKs and the libraries on that instance. Also, it's probably worth just turning them off when you're not using them, because these machine learning instances can be relatively expensive. Anyway, that's it for this video. In upcoming videos, we're going to go into SageMaker Studio, and we'll look at the difference between notebooks and Studio. And so if you don't want to miss that, then please do subscribe to this channel. Maybe give me a like and hit that bell so that you get the notifications when new videos drop. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.